Welcome to Now It's History, the podcast, Episode 1. Thanks for joining me, Richard Galant. We're on a journey to explore the dividing line between the present and the past, on how we got here and where things are going. Are you ready for another surprise? An October surprise? We're in the final stages of one of the most unpredictable, chaotic, and consequential presidential election campaigns in recent memory. And yet American history is full of examples of October surprises. And how have such surprises affected presidential campaigns in the past? In this episode, you'll learn which campaign year had two big October surprises, what tends to drive a last-minute election surprise, and whether Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are particularly vulnerable to one. I'm delighted that our first guest is Julian Zelizer. Julian is a very busy guy. In addition to being a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton, he's a regular guest on NPR's Here and Now, a guest host on POTUS Sirius XM, and a columnist for foreign policy. Julian is the author and editor of an astounding 26 books. His newest book, co-edited with Karen Greenberg, is Our Nation at Risk: Election Security as a National Security Issue. It's very, very timely in light of this election. So here we go with Julian Zelizer. Julian, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's fun to be with you.
So, who first coined the phrase October surprise, and what was he referring to?
Well, the October surprise concept really isn't popularized until 1980. And it's William Casey, who's someone who is working with Ronald Reagan, who's running against President Jimmy Carter. Carter's in the middle of dealing with the Iran hostage crisis, and Casey is very worried that in October, right before the election, that Carter is going to announce that the crisis had been resolved, the hostages are being released, and based on internal polling, that would probably have been enough to give Carter a victory, which ultimately he didn't have. And Casey's interesting in that he had been worried about this in other elections as well, but that's when you start to hear the term October surprise, and he's usually credited with popularizing it.
And of course, you want to describe what happened with the release of the hostages?
Yeah, I mean, so in some ways the surprise is on Carter, meaning Carter does negotiate an end to this, and he's working it out behind the scenes, but the negotiations go well after the election is over, which Reagan, of course, wins. And then before the inauguration, Carter is able to work out a deal. This is the issue most people in this country had been following day in and day out. And the Iranians, though, won't release the hostages until after Reagan is officially president. In some ways, they want a bit more retribution against Carter, who they really dislike. So Carter resolves it behind the scenes through diplomacy and negotiation. Reagan is inaugurated, and Americans literally watch a split screen as the inauguration is taking place, as it's announced the hostages are coming home. So Reagan gets the credit in the end for something that Carter did.
So there were October surprises actually going back to the 19th century. Would you be able to mention one of them?
Yeah, I mean, look, the calendar doesn't change, so October always comes before November, and so things happen. And there's a history of dramatic moments that some look to in terms of affecting the election. One was in 1884, there's a minister who says the Democrats are the party of Romanism and rebellion, which is a way to refer to alcohol and Catholicism and secession. And the Democrats kind of fire back against the Republican candidate, James Blaine, and said he's anti-Catholic, which is damaging in certain key cities and places like New York. Ultimately, he loses to Grover Cleveland, who does very well. He's successful with Irish Catholic voters, and some people think that Blaine took too long to respond to the charge that he was anti-Catholic, and that helped secure the election for Cleveland. So that's one example of many when something big happens in October that impacts the election. And there's other cases where something big happens and it doesn't end up impacting the election at all.
A lot of people have pointed to the 1968 election as one that has some parallels with this year's extraordinary election. Was there an October surprise then?
Well, both parties are very worried about it, and there's a bit of an October surprise, yes. And this is when William Casey, who we discussed earlier, starts to become concerned with this phenomenon. Basically, by October, the incumbent president, Lyndon Johnson, had dramatically withdrawn from the campaign in March and said he's not running and he's going to focus his energy on ending the war in Vietnam. So he's succeeded by Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who's a liberal Democrat from Minnesota. Humphrey's running against the former Vice President, Richard Nixon. And Vietnam is the issue of the moment, like the Iran hostage crisis was in 1980, but even more. It's, tearing the country apart. It's the defining issue. And the Nixon team is very worried in October that Johnson is going to announce that there is a bombing halt, that the U.S. is temporarily suspending or completely suspending operations there and suggest that the war is over. And on October 31st, that is what President Johnson announced. As he announces there's a temporary bombing halt in North Vietnam. And many people are speculating, was this a political decision? Was it a diplomatic decision? And that's really the first part of the October surprise. The second part, and Johnson knew this, although Americans only came to learn this much further down the road, is that people connected to the Nixon campaign actually reach out to the Vietnamese, to the South Vietnamese, and say, don't accept any kind of negotiations now. Don't accept any kinds of deals. Wait, if Nixon's president, you'll get a better deal. And Johnson finds out about this. He's furious. He confronts Everett Dirksen, who's the Senate Republican minority leader. He says this is treason, what Nixon is doing. And in the end, Johnson doesn't say anything because he's very worried. He doesn't want to subvert Nixon should he become president. He doesn't want to reveal that the U.S. was wiretapping embassies. And so this all stays below the radar. But some historians and journalists who write about this have argued that it actually, this kind of secret diplomacy from a candidate undermined a possibility for a quicker peace and the war would be extended to 1973. And of course, Nixon wins in 1968. So even though in 80 is when the term gets coined, this in some ways remains the quintessential example of how this can become a big issue.
In more recent times, we've seen October surprises in the 2016 campaign when Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton. There was, of course, the Comey intervention regarding Clinton, and then the Access Hollywood tape involving Donald Trump. What do you make of that month of October surprises?
Yeah, that was a big one, although we've learned with the former president, surprises are part of what you get when he's in the political mix. But the Access Hollywood, of course, was dramatic at the time. You hear Trump, who will become president, using the kind of language about women and suggesting how aggressive he's been with them. And you hear it firsthand. And many Republicans, when they hear this, are very worried. Some want him to step out of the race in October. That's not what Trump does. And in the end, that October surprise doesn't seem to detrimentally impact his campaign. Some argue it helped. It kind of helped shape the kind of fighting persona, not caring about decorum persona, and a certain kind of aggressive posture toward women persona that all became part of the MAGA movement. And the other surprise, of course, was this ongoing investigation that into Hillary Clinton and emails that she had, private emails, that the Republicans had really made a central issue. They had used this to paint her not as an experienced person, former First Lady, Senator, Secretary of State, but as someone who is corrupt. At the Republican convention, the Lock Me Up chant was front and center. But it seemed by October this was all coming to an end, that the FBI had closed any investigation into this email server. But what happens is the FBI director, James Comey, releases this message, and he says that he's reopening the investigation because they found some other emails on someone's laptop, I believe, and Anthony Weiner, who was a member of Congress, and it opens it up right at the end of October. There's some polling people who say that helped push Trump to victory. So it's disputed, others say, and I think there's a lot of credibility. There were many factors at work. Clinton's team not polling in key states at the end, like Wisconsin, and just, more structural problems with the campaign. But this is certainly one example people who are, believers in October surprises still look to as an influential, effective moment.
And then when we look at this year's campaign, how vulnerable do you think Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are to October surprises?
It's hard. I mean, you can cut it both ways. If you've been following the campaign, which I'm sure all your readers have been following, we've had endless surprises. So it's not an October surprise. We have a monthly surprise. We had Biden withdrawing from the race. We had the drama of the conventions, 2 assassination attempts, and more. And so this is a kind of shortened campaign where there's so much change. It's likely there'll be more in October. I mean, if you're betting just based on what's happened since July, why should October be different? The only surprise in some ways would be if nothing really happened, and this is the campaign right through November. So there is reason to think stuff can happen. Trump is obviously hard to predict. He doesn't like stability, so he'll be throwing everything out, and one might stick. Harris is a bit untested or less known, so it's easier in some ways to bring things up that people didn't know about. And we're in a moment when world events are so turbulent, you just don't know exactly what is going to happen. On the other hand, it's not clear if that happens, it will make a difference. I mean, we have seen in this campaign the polarization of the electorate is incredibly strong, and all the surprises I just mentioned have not totally changed the election other than the Biden-Harris replacement or Harris replacing Biden. It's really the only moment the polls change significantly. So there's a high chance something big will happen in October, but it's also likely this 50-50 map is going to be what we're looking at come Election Day.
When you were talking about 1968 and 1980, it kind of brought up the question of whether the ongoing wars in the Middle East are potentially subject to October surprises.
They might be. I mean, there's many ways to think of it, but for example, and as we were recording this, it's harder to imagine. But had we talked about this a couple days ago, you could imagine a ceasefire agreement being reached between the Israelis and Palestinians in October that would benefit Vice President Harris by benefiting the administration, bringing this conflict to an end. Now it seems to be moving in a different direction. And so the question is, would a surprise in the Middle East involve an end to the conflict? Will it be an acceleration dramatically of the conflict that then has impacts here on the domestic front, and obviously similar with Ukraine and Russia? Or the October surprise might be an area we're not even looking at that becomes problematic in the next few weeks. So, foreign policy is an area where this stuff can happen easily because it's the least controllable area of policy as opposed to domestic issues where I think politicians can often have a stronger hold on what's going to happen within a given time frame.
So when you look at the history of October surprises as you have, and you've gone into a lot of depth for when they've happened and many other campaigns other than the ones we've had time to discuss, what do you think is the bottom line in terms of, do they matter as much as we tend to think they do, or matter less?
Well, just to come back to a classic historian's answer, they do and they don't, meaning things happen in October. October always comes before the election. So events in October will shape, like every other part of the campaign, will shape the final outcome, like a debate, like dramatic appearance or decision or proclamation. They can play a part, but I don't think they're the make or break events that we think they are. It's really hard to find one where it is so decisively the factor in the outcome. It's easy to find many where nothing happens, where the victim, so to speak, of the October surprise wins. And then add to that our polarized era that we've been in since the 1990s. It's really hard to have game-changing moments at all. So I think October surprise tends to be a little bit overblown. It's more of a fear that campaign consultants have. It's a story many of us in the media certainly follow and voters might think about, but I'm not convinced these are decisive events in American political history.
Well, Julian, I want to thank you tremendously for joining us and shedding light on what could be in store for us the next several weeks. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we appreciate it.
I enjoyed it.
That's a wrap for our October surprise episode. Please share this episode with others who might be interested. The show relies on listener support. Subscribe to the podcast, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, or give us a rating on Spotify if you enjoyed the show. In coming weeks, we're going to delve into the key historical role of the Electoral College and the fascinating life story of John Hancock, who made sure that you couldn't miss his signature on the Declaration of Independence. Thanks again for joining me, and I want to give a special shout out to Jason Sanderson for his editing work on this episode. We'll see you on the next page.